We have all grown used to seeing the same scene in movies. Hundreds of archers raise their bows at once, the commander gives the order, and thousands of arrows darken the sky as they rain down on the enemy. Films rarely show an archer whose hands are trembling from exhaustion. They do not show arrows running out, breathing becoming uneven, or how much harder it becomes to draw a heavy warbow after dozens of shots. It often seems as though a medieval archer could shoot endlessly without losing either strength or accuracy. In reality, things were very different. A skilled archer was one of the most valuable soldiers in a medieval army. Not everyone could simply pick up a warbow and walk onto a battlefield. It required years of training, immense physical strength, endurance, and the ability to remain calm while heavy cavalry charged directly toward you. The bow itself appeared long before the Middle Ages. People had used it for hunting and warfare for thousands of years. But during the medieval period, some states transformed archers into an organized and deadly force capable of changing the outcome of major battles. So let us step into the life of a medieval archer. To understand how difficult it was to train a medieval archer, it is useful to compare England and France, the two main opponents of the 100 Years' War. Let us begin with England. The English war bow was not a weapon that could simply be handed to a new recruit before a battle. Its difficulty came not so much from its enormous length, but from the strength required to draw it. Some surviving warbows are around 2 meters long, and estimates of their draw weights are far greater than those of most modern sporting bows. Using such a weapon required powerful muscles in the back, shoulders, and arms. It also demanded endurance, proper technique, and the ability to repeat the same movement again and again. Future archers therefore began training while they were still young. In medieval England, the preparation of an archer could last 10 to 15 years before he was sent into battle for the first time. Boys were often taught from around the age of 10, either by their fathers or by instructors who trained children from nearby villages. Training could last for several hours a day. According to some popular accounts, boys were not even given bows at first. Instead, they stood holding heavy stones at arm's length, gradually increasing the weight. The goal was to develop an iron shoulder, the ability to hold a bow steady without the slightest tremor. After years of daily practice, an experienced English archer could shoot several arrows in a single minute while maintaining a useful degree of accuracy. Some accounts claim that skilled archers could strike small targets from very long distances or aim for vulnerable areas in a knight's armor. Their training also included shooting in a high arc rather than directly at a target. This allowed arrows to fall into dense enemy formations from above. The physical strain was so severe that the bodies of lifelong archers could be visibly changed. Archaeologists studying skeletons believed to belong to archers have found unusual changes in the spine, shoulders, and finger bones, possibly caused by years of drawing powerful bows. But England did not rely only on the personal motivation of individual men. Archery training was supported by the state. In 1365, King Edward III issued an order restricting football, handball, and other activities considered useless by the government. Men were expected to spend their free time practicing with the bow. A whole culture gradually developed around village archery grounds. Fathers passed their skills to their sons, men competed with one another, and the crown gained access to a large pool of people who were already familiar with the weapon. This did not mean that every English peasant automatically became a great archer, but from among the thousands who practiced, the crown could select the strongest, most experienced, and most enduring men. The French system. In France, the situation developed differently. French armies also used bows and crossbows. Archery associations existed in towns, and French kings hired professional crossbowmen, including the famous Genoese mercenaries. However, For a long time, France failed to create a reserve of archers as large and consistently trained as the one available to England. The reason was not that the French were physically weaker or naturally worse shots. The two countries had different military systems. For decades, the English crown had relied on archers in wars against the Welsh, the Scots, and the French. The French army depended more heavily on feudal cavalry, urban militias, mercenaries, and the private forces of individual nobles. The training of missile troops was therefore less standardized. Defeats at Crécy and Agincourt demonstrated how dangerous a large and organized force of English archers could be. But it took the French state a long time to carry out its own infantry reforms. In 1448, King Charles VII created the so-called Franks archers, or free archers. Each parish or group of parishes was expected to select one man capable of military service. The local community provided him with a bow, arrows, a sword, and protective equipment. In exchange for his service, he was exempted from certain taxes, which is where the name free archer came from. He was expected to practice archery on Sundays and religious holidays, keep his equipment in good condition, and be ready to serve whenever the king called him. That was how archers were trained. But how were their bows and arrows made? Bows and arrows training and maintaining large numbers of archers was expensive. Producing bows, arrows, and other military supplies was also a difficult task. A trained archer was useless without a reliable weapon. The creation of a bow began with the search for suitable wood. Yew was particularly valuable because of the unusual structure of its timber. The pale outer sapwood handled tension well, while the darker heartwood resisted compression. When the archer drew the string, these two layers worked together, turning a single piece of wood into a powerful natural spring. The bowyer selected a long, relatively straight section of timber without large knots or cracks. A stave was cut from it and then slowly seasoned. If the craftsman began working with wood that was still too wet, the bow could warp or split. After the stave had dried, the bowyer gradually removed excess wood. The center remained thick while the limbs narrowed toward the ends. The English longbow often had a D-shaped cross-section with a relatively flat outer side and a rounded inner side. The most difficult stage was not shaping the bow, but adjusting the way it bent. The bowyer fitted a temporary string, bent the stave slightly, and observed how both limbs moved. Areas that remained too stiff were carefully trimmed. If too much wood was removed, months of work could end with a single crack. The process was repeated until both limbs bent evenly. The bow was then tested at gradually increasing draw lengths, smoothed, and protected from moisture. The finished weapon could be as tall as a man or even taller. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a piece of wood with a string, but behind that apparent simplicity were high-quality materials, the experience of the bowyer, and many hours of careful work. Yet the bow alone was not enough. Every shot required an arrow, and a large army needed hundreds of thousands of them. Their manufacture was no less complicated. Producing an arrow was an extremely labor-intensive and costly process. Several different craftsmen were involved. A blacksmith, sometimes specializing in arrowheads, forged the metal points. Another craftsman prepared the wooden shafts. Finally, a fletcher assembled the parts, attached the feathers, and turned the separate components into a finished weapon. The process began with the shaft. It had to be straight, strong, and not excessively heavy. Even a slight bend could cause the arrow to veer away from its target or become unstable in flight. The wooden blanks were cut, dried, shaped, and carefully straightened. The wood could be gently heated, allowing the craftsman to correct bends by hand. This process was repeated until the shaft was sufficiently straight. Surviving arrows from the warship Mary Rose show that ash was not the only wood used. Most of the recovered examples were made from poplar, although ash, beech, and hazel were also found. The average length of the complete shafts was around 76 centimeters. These arrows date from the 16th century, but they provide valuable evidence of the later English tradition of military arrow production. A heavier shaft did not necessarily allow an arrow to travel farther. When shot from the same bow, a heavier arrow usually moved more slowly, but retained more energy and stability in flight. A lighter arrow could achieve a higher initial speed, but it lost that speed more quickly. The craftsman therefore had to select not only a straight shaft, but one with the correct stiffness for the power of the bow. An arrow that was too flexible could bend excessively when released, fly off course, or even break. An arrow that was too stiff could also behave poorly in flight. A metal point was fitted to the front of the shaft. Its design depended on the intended target. Broad, sometimes barbed arrowheads could inflict terrible wounds on unarmored soldiers and horses. Narrow bodkin points concentrated the force of the impact into a much smaller area. They could be dangerous against mail, thinner or lower quality pieces of protection, and vulnerable gaps in armor. However, the bodkin should not be imagined as a magical armor-piercing weapon. A high-quality steel breastplate could stop an arrow. The result depended on the power of the bow, the distance, the angle of impact, the design of the arrowhead, and the quality of the armor. Fletching was equally important. An arrow usually carried 3 feathers. Strong flight feathers from geese were especially valuable. The fletcher trimmed each feather into the required shape, glued it to the shaft, and secured it with thread. The binding prevented the feathers from tearing away during storage or shooting. Feathers were often taken from the same wing of the bird, because their natural curve needed to face the same direction. Properly fitted fletching stabilized the arrow and prevented it from tumbling through the air. At the rear of the shaft, a groove for the bowstring was cut. This was known as the nock. On some arrows, it was cut directly into the wood. On others, the end of the shaft could be reinforced with horn so that the powerful bowstring would not split it during the shot. Once the arrow had been assembled, the craftsman checked its straightness, weight, and stiffness. Ideally, arrows from the same batch needed to behave in a similar way. If one was much heavier or stiffer than the others, the archer could not expect it to follow the same trajectory. A single war arrow therefore represented the combined work of woodcutters, carpenters, blacksmiths, shaft makers, and fletchers. But an army did not need dozens of arrows. It needed hundreds of thousands. A skilled craftsman in the 12th century might produce around 5 to 8 good arrows in a day. Arrows were produced in large batches and bundled into groups known as sheaves. A sheaf usually contained 24 arrows. Between 1341 and 1359, the English crown purchased more than 51,000 such bundles, over 1.2 million arrows. The scale of production becomes even clearer when we consider the feathers. If one arrow required 3 feathers, then producing 100,000 arrows required around 300,000 suitable feathers, without even counting damaged or rejected material. In 1417, the English authorities ordered the collection of 6 feathers from every goose in 20 southern counties. In December 1418, sheriffs were instructed to supply more than 1 million goose feathers for royal use by the following year, and those were only the feathers. At the same time, hundreds of thousands of straight shafts had to be prepared, the same number of arrowheads had to be forged, and large quantities of thread and glue had to be produced. The arrows then needed to be assembled, inspected, bundled, stored, and delivered to the army. For Henry V's campaign, which ended with the Battle of Agincourt, the crown purchased around 300,000 arrows. Dozens of carts were required to transport them. This gives us some idea of the enormous amount of work required to produce and deliver such a vast quantity of weapons and ammunition. The bow's greatest advantage was its ability to strike the enemy from a distance. The first task of English commanders was therefore to prevent the enemy from reaching the archers too quickly. Before battle, the English army tried to occupy a position where the enemy's numerical superiority would become less useful. Narrow ground, hills, forests, hedges, marshy soil, and other natural obstacles were especially valuable. They prevented enemy cavalry from moving around the flanks and forced advancing troops into restricted areas. But favorable terrain alone was not enough. The archers had to strengthen their own positions. They carried long, sharpened stakes, drove them into the ground at an angle, and pointed them toward the enemy. These obstacles did not form an impenetrable wooden wall, but they forced mounted soldiers to stop, change direction, or risk injuring their horses. Branches, pieces of fencing, and other available materials could also be used to create obstacles. In the most common reconstruction of the English formation, heavily armored men-at-arms occupied the center, while archers stood on the sides. This allowed the bowmen to shoot at the approaching enemy not only from the front, but also from an angle. The exact formation could vary from one battle to another, so the famous diagrams showing perfectly V-shaped groups of archers should not be treated as a universal rule, but any such tactic depended on strict discipline. The archers had to hold their positions, avoid breaking formation too early, and resist the temptation to pursue a retreating enemy in search of loot or prisoners. English military ordinances imposed severe punishments for unauthorized looting and for the famous cry of havoc, which could serve as a signal to begin plundering. A man who gave the signal too early risked his life because breaking the formation could endanger the entire army. In movies, the commander usually raises his hand. Thousands of archers draw their bows at the same moment and then release their arrows on a single command. Real shooting probably looked less perfect. Archers could begin shooting after a signal and direct their fire toward a particular area, but constant, fully synchronized volleys are more of a cinematic image. The important factor was not thousands of men moving at precisely the same moment, but a continuous stream of arrows striking an advancing formation. At long range, archers did not always try to select an individual target. Instead, they fired into a dense mass of troops, creating a dangerous zone through which the enemy had to advance. Even when arrows could not penetrate a high-quality breastplate, they could strike horses, faces, arms, legs, gaps between pieces of armor, and soldiers wearing weaker protection. The bombardment also forced men to lower their visors, shield themselves, and lose formation. A well-armored fighter might survive a direct hit, but still stumble, stop, or collide with the men around him. One of the greatest examples of the effectiveness of English archers was the Battle of Agincourt, fought on October 25, 1415. The army of the English king Henry V was marching toward Calais after a difficult campaign in France. The English had endured the long siege of Harfleur, disease, shortages of food, and an exhausting march. Many soldiers were weakened, while the French army blocking their path was significantly larger. It seemed that the English had almost no chance of victory. However, Henry V occupied an extremely favorable position. The battlefield lay between two wooded areas, which narrowed the available space and prevented the French from easily moving around the English flanks. Heavy rain had fallen the previous day, the plowed ground became waterlogged and turned into thick mud. For the lightly equipped English archers, it was an inconvenience. For heavily armored French soldiers, it became a trap. The English knights and men-at-arms formed in the center. The archers occupied positions on both sides and placed long, sharpened stakes in front of themselves. They drove the stakes into the ground at an angle, with the points facing the enemy. These obstacles were intended to protect the archers from cavalry attacks. The French delayed their advance for a long time. Henry then ordered his army to move closer. The English archers carried their stakes forward, installed them again, and prepared to shoot. When the French came within range, English arrows rose into the air. Thousands of missiles fell upon the advancing soldiers. The arrows did not always penetrate high-quality breastplates, but they struck horses, faces, arms, legs, and gaps between pieces of armor. They forced the French to lower their heads, protect themselves, and lose formation. French cavalry moved against the archers first, but the force restricted their ability to maneuver, while the sharpened stakes prevented them from charging directly into the English bowmen. Under the bombardment, horses were wounded, frightened, and driven out of control. Some riders turned back, while others fell. The retreating horses churned the wet ground even further in front of the advancing French infantry. Then, the main French force moved forward. Thousands of heavily armored soldiers advanced on foot through the mud. With every step, their legs sank into the soft earth. They had to spend their strength not only moving forward, but simply remaining on their feet. The English archers continued to shoot. The French ranks gradually became more compressed. The space between the two forests was too narrow for such a large mass of men to move freely. The soldiers in the rear pressed against those in front, while fallen men blocked the path of those who followed. The closer the French came to the English positions, the worse their situation became. They had already crossed hundreds of meters of mud under constant fire. Many were wounded, exhausted, and trapped among their own comrades. At last, the French men-at-arms reached the English line, and a brutal hand-to-hand struggle began. When the distance became too short for shooting, the English archers put down their bows and joined the fighting themselves. They used swords, daggers, axes, and heavy wooden mallets that had previously been used to drive the stakes into the ground. The more lightly equipped archers could move more easily across the muddy ground. They attacked the exhausted French soldiers from the sides and rear and killed men who had fallen into the mud. In such a dense crowd, falling could be fatal. A heavily armored man found it difficult to stand up, especially when other soldiers fell on top of him. Some died from wounds, while others suffocated or were crushed in the chaos. The French army lost control. Its numerical superiority, which should have guaranteed victory, became a weakness. On such a narrow and muddy battlefield, the huge number of soldiers only increased the confusion. The English also suffered losses. A French detachment managed to move around the main battlefield and attack the English baggage train. Both men-at-arms and archers were killed in the main fighting. However, French losses were far heavier. The victory at Agincourt was not achieved by the longbow alone. The English benefited from a combination of factors: the narrow battlefield, the mud, the sharpened stakes, strict discipline, intelligent deployment, and the years of training given to the archers. The arrows wounded the enemy and disrupted his formation. The mud drained his strength. The narrow battlefield turned the advance into a crushing mass of men, and when the French finally reached the English line, the archers joined the hand-to-hand fighting themselves. Agincourt demonstrated an important truth. An experienced archer was not simply a man who shot from a distance. He could fortify a position, hold formation, manage his ammunition, and, at the decisive moment, put down his bow and fight as an infantryman. Conclusion. There are many myths surrounding the medieval bow. Archers did not have an endless supply of arrows. They could not shoot forever without becoming exhausted, and their arrows could not penetrate every type of armor. Their power came not only from the weapon itself, but from years of training, discipline, reliable supply lines, and effective tactics. The bow did not win battles on its own. Victory belonged to the entire military system that stood behind the archer.